Hey, buyers and sellers, have you heard the great news about real estate commissions? Realtors are now going to be working for free. Woohoo! Hey, hang tight. I'm going to talk about what's going on about commissions and how that may not necessarily be the case. All right, folks, if you haven't already heard, back on March 15th of this year, the National Association of REALTORS entered into a proposed settlement that was brought to them by homeowners. Now, this lawsuit's been going on for a couple years, but it was just kind of proposed settlement. Now, the rule changes, there's going to be a number of rule changes that actually roll out because of this. They are not set in stone. I believe a judge still has to approve them. However, we're all anticipating some rule changes probably mid-July, so kind of the summer of 2024. Some of these rule changes are going to come into effect. So I've heard a lot of different stories. If you listen to the headlines, it sounds like realtors are going to get, all their commissions are getting cut in half, right? So let me just kind of set that aside and say that's actually not necessarily what's going on. But let's kind of go through what these rule changes are and how that's going to affect things for the general public, for you, and then also how things are going to change a little bit differently. Okay, so the first thing is the first rule change is, let's talk about buyer representation. So currently, thank goodness, in the state of Georgia, we've had this in place for over 20 years, that we already have a buyer-broker agreement in place. So as you as a buyer, when you hire an agent to help you purchase a home, you have an agreement in place. Now, we've had that in place for 20 years. There's a lot of states that have never had that in place. That's where one of the big issues actually came up with, in those states that didn't have any buyer-broker agreements. So the state of Georgia, we're good. There is going to be a couple different changes. Number one, we're going to have to change our agreement to really reflect exactly who's paying the commissions. That's going to be negotiated between the buyer and the buyer broker agent at this point. Now, that's going to be something that's a little bit different and a little bit different twist to it, because we usually relied on the listing agent to provide us what was going to be covered. So that's going to be a little bit different, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Another one of the big changes is going to be, they are going to require that this kind of an agreement be in place before an agent even opens up a door for you to show. Now, that's different, because basically how it works right now is you, the buyer, finds a house online through your favorite platform, and you hit the little button that says, I want to schedule a tour. You get in contact with an agent, and they say, sure, I'll go ahead and meet you out at the house. They open up the door for you, you go through it, and you either like it or you don't, right? That's how it works right now, with no agreement, nothing in place. That's going to change. Now you got to have a piece of paper or a contract or an agreement in place that basically indicates that if you like this house and you're going to buy it, here's how much you're going to have to pay this agent that's opening up the door for you and helping you through the whole transaction. Obviously, there's a lot of services and value add that they're going to be providing you outside of just simply opening up a door. However, that document's going to have to be in place. I think the current buyer-broker agreement that we have is overkill for that. I believe that if you are simply just wanting to look at one house, we're going to have to come up with some other new agreement that's not out there yet. Maybe a boilerplate, maybe one or two sentences that says, hey, listen, as an agent, I am helping you with this particular house, 123 Main Street. And if you decide to go forward with purchasing this house, this is what my commissions will be. But it is not going to obligate you to only work with me for the next year. So I think that's going to have to get developed. Not really quite sure. I'm just kind of going off of what makes sense to me. So that's going to be a big change for buyer and buyer agreement. Here, here's what you need to pull out of this. You're going to have to negotiate with an agent of what commissions you're willing to pay. Now, this is going to have ramifications, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Is that commission may or may not get covered by the seller now. All right, so that may be an additional cost that you need to come out of pocket with. So in addition to a down payment, in addition to maybe covering some of your closing costs, if not all of them, you are now going to have to negotiate and hope that you're going to have the money to pay an agent out of pocket, right? So that's going to be another negotiating point that you're going to have to work out directly with your agent that you're hiring and bake in or negotiate with whatever home seller you're working with. So that's going to be a big change. It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. Okay, rule number 2. All right, so currently as a listing agent, I go into a listing client and I negotiate with them on the overall commissions that we are going to charge for that service that we are providing them. Again, there's no laws. There's no set commissions. These are all negotiable, but for practical application, let's just use a number. Let's just say that I propose, listen, on the listing side, what you're going to hire Keller Williams, that's the broker I'm with, you're going to pay 3%. We charge 3% for the marketing and procuring of this transaction. And they agree to that. They're like, yes, that is fair. Great. Now let's talk on what you are willing to pay a cooperative agent to bring you a buyer. Now I will explain to them, I would recommend anywhere between, I don't know, I'm just pulling numbers out. There's no set numbers, 2.5%, 3%. Okay? And we're going to have to talk about that. Now, some sellers may say, absolutely not, I don't want to pay anything. That's fine, that's your obligation. However, I need to explain to you, Mr. Seller, that may not be in your best interest because what you are doing is placing additional financial burden on the buyers. That's that much more money that they're going to have to come up with in order to procure and buy this property. So what you're doing is you're knocking out a lot of the buyers in the market. So the buyer market used to be this, now it's down to here, okay? And it's already kind of a tight market as it is. So I would recommend that you would go ahead and compensate that buyer broker, right, for the commissions that the buyer is actually going to be paying. So that will make it easier for the buyer. It will release some of that. And that number, that commission is already baked into the price of the property. The market value has already been set and determined with that percentage baked into it. So when we sat down and we talked about what I think I can sell your house for, and we pulled comparables and looked at the market, that commission is already baked into that number. Once you start stripping that out, that gets stripped out of your price, right? So you got to take that in consideration. So anyways, that's a piece that's going to be changing. Now, the thing that's changed is that I can no longer take whatever that commission is that you are willing to cover, the amount of the buyer-broker agreement commission that you're willing to cover. I can't advertise that into the multiple listing services any longer. Used to be advertised in there. So as a buyer-broker, I would go into the MLS system and I would take a look at it and I'd say, okay, this seller is willing to cover X percent of the commissions my buyer is going to be paying. Boom. That's not going to be in there any longer. So now that just means that I got to make another phone. I got to make a phone call and take that in consideration when we actually put an agreement or an offer on the property together. It's another negotiating point. Just like we negotiate closing costs on a buyer's behalf, now we're going to have to negotiate commissions. So the tricky part of that is that, you know, some people are like, well, why don't you just simply part of your offer, just say, hey, listen, I want you to cover my closing costs and I want you to cover the commissions on my real estate. That will alleviate me having to come up with that much more cash. And it sounds simple. It's like, yeah, this sounds great. Perfect. However, the lender's rules are going to have to change because lenders have restrictions on how much contribution can be made towards a purchase. So once you take in consideration the closing costs and you negotiate that into an agreement, and then you take the commissions that a buyer's paying, you add those two things together, it's going to be over the threshold of which a lender will allow, which is not going to be good. So we got to figure that piece out. My feeling is if this really comes to fruition and it starts working through, lenders are going to have to start giving, they're going to have to loosen up the rules a little bit on how and how much money they are willing to have a seller contribute towards closing costs and commissions for a buyer. That's what my instincts kind of tell me is going to happen. But right now, that's not necessarily the case. VA loans and FHA loans, that's a totally different scenario. So those types of loans require that the seller covers commissions. That's the way the rules are written right now. A VA loan will not allow a buyer to pay for their own commissions. It has to be covered by a seller. So that's going to have to change. So as a seller, you got to take all these things in consideration. So if you say, no, I'm not paying a buyer broker, okay, no VA loans, no FHA loans, your buyer pool is shrinking down. Are you sure you want to do this? Right? So you got to take all those things in consideration. So that's going to be a big change. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting is they will allow us to advertise a seller's willingness to cover commissions outside of the multiple listing services. So I can do a Facebook post and show and advertise a particular property and saying, hey, the seller is willing to pay X amount of dollars towards a buyer commission. I can do that outside of MLS. The multiple listing services are our major database, but not inside of it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The other rule change that's going to occur is that we are now going to have some type of an agreement in place that discloses commissions. And that disclosure is going to be another layer of transparency, which is a great thing, of who's paying what and how much, and the commissions are not governed by any kind of a law, that they are totally negotiable. And no one is obligated to pay a certain dollar amount. All right? So that's just another disclosure that's going to be involved and layered on to the whole transaction itself. So that's what's going on. That's the real stuff that's going on. On a scale of 1 to 10, what's the impact of this? Probably about a 3, right? We got some rule changes. Most of it's all going to be behind the scenes and not client facing. Buyers are going to have a little bit of an issue, I think, with this buyer agreement in place, and with deals that you see that a seller is unwilling to pay any buyer commissions. That's going to, that's the biggest hurdle that we're going to have to overcome. And I believe it's the burden of the listing agent to be able to communicate back to their seller clients of why that may impact a successful sale if they decide to do that. But it's totally up to them, right? So it's negotiable, up to them. It's not up to the agents. There's no laws or anything that's governing any of this. Hopefully this was helpful to be able to clear the air of what's going on as it relates to this NAR settlement that is proposed out there. Hey, reach out to me with any questions. Love to hear your comments.